Hey fantasy degens, if you are still watching my videos at this point of the season, you are truly a fantasy degenerate like myself. Welcome to the show. This is Fantasy Underground, and we're here to talk some Overwatch, specifically this week's implications on fantasy. A lot more than I anticipated there would be. I kind of thought it would be a static week of returning to normal, but the meta is very unsettled. We have some pretty crucial free agent pickups. So this is the time of the year where if you are not, I should say if you're not paying attention. If you're watching this, you're paying attention. But I think a lot of people are tailing off, and this is a week where you might have some surprise value. That said, I myself am not in mid-season form. I don't have a list up front for you. I'll try to throw it in the comments, or if someone else can do that too, I'd appreciate it. But show's going to be a little bit more scuffed than usual today. I'm just behind schedule-wise and didn't create as many assets to support it. But watch on 2x, listen it. We've still got some good advice here, some good clips. So let's get to it. In what seemed like it might be a throwaway match in the battle for Europe, looking back on the week, the very first match of the weekend, London versus Paris, was a fairly close 3-1 in favor of Paris, where we thought, you know what, London still sucks. As the weekend unfolded, we found that's not really the case. Sparkr here gets 2 off-screen kills before dying to Vestola. One, a really nice shot on Doridro, which you don't get to fully see here. And then he also pops off and gets, who was the other guy here? He gets Onigot outside the cafe there. And all in all, this was Sparkr's debut. We were expecting something, but we weren't expecting a ton. And I think he's over-delivered what the general consensus was. I liked him more than the general public, but I still didn't quite anticipate this. What we saw was Sparkr was enabling the rest of London. It's still my belief that Hybrid was the worst starting player on the roster of London, and subbing him out for Sparkr, who may be their best player, was a notable difference. And as you'll see here, we get some classic Shax returning on Tracer. I think, I haven't gone through this in the replay reviewer. I need to. But ultimately, I think Sparkr is enough of a threat that he's opening things up for the rest of London. So although they lose this match 3-1 to Paris, Sparkr has an extremely solid debut, as you've seen here on the Hanzo. Sparkr does fit the mold of your classic hit scan, and we see him here on the McCree, where he performed generally pretty well over the course of the weekend. Here he gets a pretty interesting stun, although he then overextends and dies in what was a pretty critical element here. He definitely, I don't want to say he's out of position, but he made an aggressive play trying to stop the Deadeye and get a quick kill, and was immediately punished for it. So he's an aggressive player. He looks for opportunities and he creates plays, although he's not error-free. On top of being your classic hit scan, he does have the flexibility to move over the Tracer. I don't think he is Shaq's level, but he did, back in Contenders, have arguably arguably the best. He was definitely one of the best Tracers in European Contenders before joining Owl. He's definitely proficient on the hero, and you'll see situations here where it's going to allow them to put in Blase from time to time because because Sparkr can play the Tracer. So it hurts Shax's value a little bit unless you get into like a straight Tracer Ash type composition. You can't guarantee 100% Sparkr, 100% Shax, but I think it all speaks to Sparkr is now the carry DPS on this team. I don't think he is, shy or leave level in that degree, but I think he's likely to get, 80 to 100% start time going forward. He's the man, and this week he kind of showed he's the, I don't know, I'm tired, guys. He's the center of the DPS line for London. I really liked what I saw, and he is increasing their competitiveness as an entire roster. Speaking of London, after they lost 3-1 to Paris, they played the Shock, and who would have thought they would have a closer match here than they did against Paris, where they lost 3-2 in a pretty epic battle against the Shock. This was a match with a lot of violent swings, where one team would look amazing and the other would look terrible, and this is on both sides. Anytime there's violent swings in a match on one team looking great, then looking terrible the next, it's not two teams playing at their best. It's, players making mistakes. And in this case, the Shock try to make a kind of ridiculous approach here, where they run through the tunnel with Dragon. They have to expend Immortality Field, and as they pop out, Molfig nails them with the Flux. Just back to back, not the best ult tracking, coming out in these clumps and paying for it. Overall, Hadi and Molfig were even looking good in this matchup. I'm going to stand by and say Hybrid, not a high performer. He's been part of what's holding them back. I think Hadi and Molfig, and both Kelix and Ripa, they're serviceable as respective tank and support lines. Not great, but they're serviceable. On the Shock side of things, we definitely saw, nice plays here and there by, the classic guys here. Glister really stood out this week, although he's here on the sim. We'll get to some talk of him later. He looked pretty solid on the Tracer, kind of doing his impression of Striker, and really being standout player for them this week, where Nero was okay. Choyobin, from time to time did well, but we'll get into Shock here a little bit more in a second. Jumping over to Gladiators versus Shock, the main point here is Ons had his debut. So glad to have him back, although fantasy-wise and week 1-wise, not a major impact player. He mostly played the Sombra, where here you'll see, he had a, as far as they go, good single-man EMP where they were able to take down Muse, but there's not a lot of clips of him. He was mostly playing the Sombra on limited control maps. You can tell they're trying to work him in. He's not fully part of the lineup yet. He's not the king we knew from the end of last year, but it was not a bad debut. So, yeah, it would have been nice to say he's the top pickup this week. He's back. He's amazing. We're not there. You may not have time to pick him up on your roster if you need DPS players to start right away. We'll have to see how he ramps up. He's still a very high-risk, high-reward pickup. And if he's free in your league and you missed him, you're okay. You don't have to be kicking yourself. But we'll keep a close eye on when he becomes really worth picking up. This was a great 3-2 matchup where the Shock and Glads both were looking good. It's hard to know exactly what to think of both of these teams after the Shock just barely beat London and after the Gladiators were reverse swept by Paris. It was definitely really interesting. What we did see is reason to have a little bit more faith in Glister. Kevster was the better Tracer player among the two. Kevster, now that he's back in united with the rest of the team, he looks a little bit, maybe he looks a little bit better. He's looked really solid all around, but Kevster continues to impress. He might be one of those hyper flex type players, and when Ons was getting just a little bit of playtime on the Widow, Kevster was making him pay for it. The Glad's DPS rotation was really interesting. I think Kevster is the alpha here and really the only player, only DPS from the Gladiators you can start confidently. They rotated Mirror and Birdring out. They even rotated Kevster out. But the problem is Birdring is not playing your high-value Ashe-type picks. He was playing a ton of Sombra. Mirror was playing a lot of Doomfist. And of all the things that we saw, he was probably the most exploitable, the weakest link here. Although he's, in interviews that we saw with him, he's definitely plugging the team's gaps, helping them round out the meta. He's a very flexible player, but to me, he's also looked like the weakest of the DPS lineup. So we'll have to see how this one shakes out, but I don't feel great about starting Birdring or Mirror right now. A couple last minute things here. Space is looking really, really good. I've really enjoyed his diva play. I always think that's been his best hero, and he was making plays all over the place, eating ults, clutch bombs, good matrices, all the things that you'd expect to see from a diva. It was all there. On the Shock side of things, we did see some really weird stuff. FD God was at times rotated out, and Violet would come in and play main support alongside Twilight on the Ana. Twilight specifically played the Ana. Not enough to warrant picking him up, just enough to be a pain. If anything, I take this as a possible buy low opportunity for Violet. Once points come out, he's going to have a disappointing week because he was playing on the Lucio and Mercy so much, which is really weird. He's been their hyper flex of sorts, their mirror, their hydration, so to speak. I don't like it. It's not a good look for his fantasy value long term, but I still believe in Violet. So if someone is fed up and they're saying, I'm tired of these weird things happening, I'm worried about his long term value, Violet is still one of the greatest to ever play the game and currently one of the best in all of Overwatch. So if you can get someone to bite on a trade for him, even though there is some risk involved with it, go for it. I glazed over Paris earlier in the London matchup just because they won 3-1 as you would kind of expect. Khan doing his usual flex support dominance, his flex support diffing. As we see here, Kevster with a pretty nice Genji play right here. I love this one on Onigod. Just a very nice, such good clean mechanics from this player. Always fun to watch. We had some really interesting lineups from the Glads of Sombra, Genji, some Genji Echo. Lots of interesting stuff. Overall, this clip here too, displaying Kevster's insane mechanics. Not so much in this particular one because Naga is on the Mei, but he actually pulled out the McCree, and he had some good looks there as well. Naga is not some kind of monster hyperflex, but he can play the hit scan. He's solid. He's more flexible than you would think from your average projectile player, which I tried to advertise this year. And what was really interesting is I thought we would see more Tracer, and I really like Suna's Tracer, so I really expected to see more Suna. What happened, though, is Onigod was playing very well on the hit scan role. And with that happening, it was pretty interesting. Like he was doing very well on the hit scan. He wasn't his normal, what I consider to be his normal average level of play, but he also moved over to the Tracer, and he played Tracer, fairly well. I don't see it a lot from him. He did a good job. Naga in those cases was swapping over to McCree, where he is more than serviceable. Onigod's outperforming what I would have expected, and I think he's a short-term starter here. Sorry, Kevster with the awesome Blizzard. I love this particular play too, where he went on the wall. Kevster to me is superstar material here. And while Naga and Onigod might not be quite that level of superstar in my book, they're both really good starts right now. And we'll see on Naga here in just a second. For me, Naga's signature hero is his Pharah. And after going down 2-0 to the Gladiators, they had the most amazing comeback we've seen from them all year. And on map 5, it was partially behind Naga's Pharah. While he's going to be weighed down by playing a lot of Mei, he played a bit of Pharah, and his McCree was good. So if you can start Onigod, if you can start Naga in the short term here, Paris is looking good, and I do expect them to play over Suna based on how things are going with them this week. They won more when Suna was out. They look really strong and had a 2-0 record. Kind of sucks that they're playing Vancouver this upcoming week. It's going to hurt you. But I think both of these guys have some nice value here right now as Paris is riding high. Not amazing value, though, just weighed down by the easy schedule this upcoming week. If we move on through the gauntlet that was this week, let's jump over to APAC for a little while. Seoul and Chengdu had a pretty interesting match. Seoul really crushed it this week. This one was notable for me because Fitz was on the Tracer. We don't see that a lot. He's a pretty elite tier level Sombra in hit scan, but to see him bust out the Tracer was very interesting. Just one of those things that supports his being one of the absolute best DPS in the league. The only other player that had this really surprise busting out of a Tracer like this is Lip. If I'm trying to compare in the small sample size of both of these players, I do like Lip's Tracer better than Fitz's. But at the same time, hey, it's good knowing he has this in his wheelhouse. Fitz is a monster. He can do it all. The biggest news of the week, though, for Seoul would be Gesture starting. I know I'm jumping around a little bit here. Let me get to Gesture in a second. We've got Taro Cookie in the last clip and in this one. This one, it's more of a non-highlight than it is a highlight. Taro Cookie looked fine on where he mostly played the McCree. If we're talking pure hit scan potential, I kind of like Jimmy more. This continues to be a revolving door outside of Leave, and I'm not excited about Taro Cookie. I'm not excited about Jinmu, even though we did get to see his Pharah just a little bit. I'm not excited about Jimmy. Each of these three guys are going to continue rotating playtime in a very unexciting manner outside of Leave. If I go back to the Seoul Dynasty, they played a lot of these shenanigans here that we have in this clip where they were teleporting around. Here they completely delete Shy, who didn't play the first map and then came in, and it didn't really make much of a difference. Seoul pretty much dominated the Sparkr. And the notable difference we saw here is Marvel on the main tank. Finally. You guys know I've long been a Marvel fan. Ever since watching Seoul struggle during GOATs, his Reinhardt to me has been one of the absolute best in the league, and I love watching him come in and seeing Seoul dominate when he does. There's not any kind of major fantasy implication, and in fact, Gesture burned me really bad in Royales this week because he was a cheap option, and I loved Seoul's schedule this week. Neither of those worked out. Seoul crushed all of their matches, and Gesture didn't even play, so whoops. Glad I didn't publicize that one too much in making that call. That said, Marvel is a waiver addition, not one to get excited about at the main tank position, but man, Seoul looked good, and it's hard to imagine them switching up the lineup after how well they did this week. When Shy was actually on the server, Seoul made it a point to really single him out. And here we have Fitz putting the pressure on him constantly, and Marvel just making a beeline to come in and finish the job. They really wanted to try and shut down Shy, and I think Marvel really helped take command of the flow of this game. Their Rhine comps were one of the strongest that we saw all week. Maybe it was the weakness of their opponents, but Seoul looks like they are going to be some of the leads of the Brawl comp this particular stage. Here we have a nice clip from Architect sticking, but also MCD really doing some work. I continue to love his level of play. Bright spot on the Sparkr, along with Bernard and Shy, who have all three of them really stood out to me as top tier players. And rest in peace, Takayaki. You may have seen that the Spark's backup main tank was released very unceremoniously after one match all year, on which he had extremely high ping. Unfortunate that didn't work out. Maybe we see him resurface again. But adios, Takayaki. Next up, as the Defiant beat the Mayhem, we saw Checkmate come in on two different maps, on the Doomfist and as well as on the Echo. Here we see him using abilities and dying, which unfortunately was generally the theme of his Doomfist over the course of the weekend. I was excited to see Checkmate come in. From his time in Contenders, I thought his Echo was serviceable, although not as good as Feather or Choisewan, which I think has proven to be true, although not that Feather's Echo has looked particularly awesome at the Owl level either. Always nice to see the rookies get some play time, but I'm not worried about Checkmate. I think he looks okay, and I think Yaki and BQB continue to be elite. So as long as this team is trying its best to win every single map, I don't think we see this guy. I would have expected, we would have gotten a preview earlier than the midway point of the season if we were going to see him at all. But not worried about him. If someone's freaking out about Yaki or BQB, buy low on that train if you can. The other surprise in this matchup was Aspire got signed to another 30-day contract. And, well, I'm not surprised because he looked really, really good. What did surprise me a little bit was seeing him on the Tracer. From my extensive research on his Wikipedia page, I knew this was one of the ones on his Rolodex on his resume, but seeing it in action was quite nice. And speaking of nice, we didn't see any nice. His tracer, which has been below average, maybe bottom 25% amongst starting tracers. It was, and I guess it was good enough. It's not like he looked terrible or anything, but seeing Aspire come in and play the tracer like this, we'll see how the meta turns out across the board. If they do go with some kind of Mei McCree lineup, if that becomes the way to go, we'll see Nice back in on the Mei. But as long as the meta is a little bit dicey like it was this last week, Toronto's does seem to favor the dive style with Sato, although he did play a bit of Rhine. All things considered, Aspire is an interesting start this week if you're hurting at DPS. No guarantees, because if we do see a hard meta shift to Brawl, then I think he could be out. But unless that hard meta shift happens, which I think is not extremely likely, Aspire makes for a very interesting Royale start, a very interesting waiver pickup. This guy's good. I think we're going to see him around an Owl for a little while here. Real quick with this highlight in the background, on an unrelated note, in the Charge versus Excelsior game, there's not too much fantasy implication here. But I did briefly want to say, with the Charge beating the Excel and now being up on them 2-1 this year, not a good look for Excelsior. Flora continues to be the alpha DPS on this team. Ivy and Guangbong both came in, and even Feather on a map. Guangbong continues to be fine. He went kind of toe-to-toe, trading blows with Eileen, who to me has not been a top-tier hit scan. Hey, at least Guangbong isn't Kaylee, but I'm not getting excited about Guangbong's Owl prospects outside of being a Widow specialist. So no major fantasy implications here other than Flora continues to be okay fantasy value-wise, and none of the other ones. On the Charge side of things, Kareev was very suspect to me with a lot of first deaths, and Krong and Choi Soo-won continue to be some of my favorite players to watch in APAC. Wish their team was a little bit better. Continuing on the Florida train here against Boston. Maybe you shouldn't say continuing on the Florida train because they really struggled. Here, I want to highlight, it's not often that I'm picking out main support play, but I did really enjoy Faith in this lineup. He just continued to make plays that caught my attention on each of the Lucio and the Brig. In this particular case, BQB comes from the library, tries to EMP and gets stunned out of it. Faith's head is on a swivel. As far as rookie main supports go, he and Ansunjae have both been extremely solid in my book. Whether or not they stay on the same teams, I don't know, but they're proving to be, to me, upper class main support players. I believe this matchup was a 3-0 in favor of the Uprising, although there was a draw in there. It was really, as far as 3-0s go, it was a pretty close one. This particular play, you may see that Punk is back at it again. He eats Yaki's Blizzard into the Graviton Flux, and although the team fight goes Florida's way, I do like Punk. I said it before, when he came in and was playing at the start of the year, he looked extremely solid. I don't know what happens with he and Gabolshi going forward. I really don't. I think they're going to cannibalize each other's values. I wouldn't be surprised if one of them becomes the main guy because they're both good enough to do it. It's just while Boston continues to be this mid-tier-ish type team, I see they have motivation to get both of their guys playtime. Unless things really click and they're making a playoff run, I don't know that they stick with one guy or the other. It's so tough to predict. Flip a coin. I wish I could tell you I knew more on this one, but both Punk and Gabolshi continue to look pretty solid. IM37, on the other hand, is more than pretty solid. He is very quietly having an elite season. While I don't know that he's like a top tier DPS player, even, sitting here praising him, I do think as far as pure hit scans go, he's really good. And his McCree has been lighting up the highlight reels ever since week 1. So while I'm not 100%, I'm going to say, yeah, he goes toe to toe. He's one of the absolute best hit scan players in the league. He's not going to be holding your team back regardless of what team you have him on. I'm not going to put him in the Lip or the Fitz or the Kai tier of players that, boggle my mind how good they are. But I think he's in the tier below those guys. You're not your S-class hit scan. He doesn't have the hyper flexibility that guys like Shy and Leave do. But as far as your, or even, speaking of Lip and Fitz as well, I don't like his Tracer, where Valentine's played that hero over him. I don't love his Sombra. When it comes to that pure hit scan play, he's an A tier player, and I don't think a lot of people grade him there. Maybe I'm off base there, and he really is. Everyone sees him that way. But IM37 has been super solid, and I really enjoyed him in this matchup where he's able to go toe-to-toe with an elite player like BQB. So, love an IM37. If you got him on your team, he's going to be racking up some more fantasy points here. And I think that about does it for the week. As far as outro stuff goes, Stats Lab is late this week, and so I think it's just a little bit more of a disorganized week on my end too. Sorry for the lack of organized show, just trying to get this content out and get to bed here. That said, I don't mean to complain. This is absolutely one of my favorite parts of my week, but, duty calls, busy at work, and need to keep on top of things there. A last few quick notes as we play out here. You don't want to overreact to some of these crazy things happening, but you do want to react. So I've tried to point out guys like Oni God, like Naga obviously comes to mind there. Sparkr, who as general mid-season malaise set in and people stop paying as much attention to their lineups, these are small tweaks that you can make to eke out a few extra points, improve your team in the short term, and really get some good fantasy value going. When the stats are out, I'll be posting a little bit more on who scored well and who didn't on my Twitter, as well as some meta statistics as well. So if you don't follow me on Twitter, I'll quickly plug that account. I don't tweet too often. I won't clog up your news feed with anything but fantasy stats, fantasy knowledge. And with that, with Stats Lab not out yet, I won't make another video, but I will be posting some of my thoughts there. So I hope you enjoyed this week's video. I hope it wasn't too disorganized for your taste. And as always, I appreciate you watching. Once again, if you hung in there on the tail end of this video at this point in the season, props to you. Thanks for watching. Love you all. Have a good rest of your week. I'm out of here.